I'm Leon Todd for G66. Welcome to another episode of Get Gig Ready. On today's video, we're going to talk about classic Marshall tones, and I want to build a VP4 preset with some effects that I think perfectly complement a classic Marshall crunch. Now, Marshall amplifiers are pretty much synonymous with the sound of rock guitar, whether it's the early designs like the JTM45 that I've got here, essentially a clone of the Fender Bassman, or the colossal 100-watt super lead or plexi amplifiers, through to the master volume designs like the Marshall 2203 and 2204, which most of us probably know as the JCM 800. Marshall have continued to release amps over the years with plenty of classics pretty much in every decade, like the Silver Jubilee, the DSL, and the JVM series. They've also got a popular series of reissue amplifiers at the moment as well. But to me, the classic sound of a Marshall amp is a humbucker equipped guitar, something like this Les Paul Custom, straight into the amp with the master volume absolutely cranked to ear-splitting volume. On top of that, the classic design of a head and 4x12 cab, mic'd up with something like a Shure SM57, contributes a massive amount to the overall tone heard on classic recordings. And what I'm going to do is start with the volume on this JTM45 at around noon. I've got the bass really low and the middle and treble cranked up on the amp, which is kind of the classic accepted way to use it. What you're going to hear is the amp get more saturated as I turn that volume control up to the point where it just becomes this glorious rock crunch. A great strategy for dealing with these amps is to dial them in with your guitar volume and tone controls wide open, and you push the amp to that saturation point where essentially you get enough distortion for your crunch tone on there. From there, you use the guitar volume, tone, and pickup selector on there to get your cleaner sound on there, or maybe your lighter crunch to heavier crunch by setting it up with, say, the volume control around 6 or 7 on the bridge pickup and then bringing it up for more gain, taking it down for less gain. Because of the design of these amplifiers and the bright cap across those volume controls on there, as you roll your guitar volume down, you're going to get a really lovely glassy, clean sound in there. That also means, though, if you're trying to use this at low volumes, the amp can be particularly bright. So using the VP4, we can use a few different effect blocks to get around that. And the classic strategy for me with this is to set the amp up for a crunch sound. So find the saturation point and back it off just a little bit. Then we're going to use a drive block for more gain, and we'll add a wah, because a Marshall amp, a Les Paul, and a wah is just such a classic combination. Then we'll add some modulation and some delay. So let's build that VP4 preset. All right, I've got the VP4 hooked up now, and let's start by adding a drive block so that I can boost this amp. As I was talking about earlier, a classic approach when you're just plugging straight into the amp is to have your guitar wide open, the amp cranked, and that's going to be your full-on lead tone, but there's nowhere to go from there. So what I like doing is stacking a drive pedal, essentially set up as a boost. So keeping the drive low, but using the level control on there to hit the front end of the amp even harder. I'm using the Valve Screamer VS9. I'm going to give you a few extra options in there, like a fuzz, an octave distortion, and the clone Chiron model in there, all of which are going to have their own character on there. Let's just start out with the Valve Screamer first, bypassed, then we're going to kick it in. I'll also bypass it again and use my guitar volume to clean everything up and get my clean sound. So I've got crunch, I've got a boosted crunch sound for my kind of lead tone, and then I can turn the drive off and use my guitar volume control to get my cleaner tone. I really like that clone Chiron in there because it still works with the guitar volume control nicely. If you back off your guitar volume control with the drive block bypass, you can get that sparkly clean, but then you can kick in the drive as an alternative to turning your volume control back up. There's so much control to be had in there. What we should add next is a wah, because that's just such a classic effect. I've got a fractal EV1 plugged into the pedal 1 jack. So let's do this. Let's go to the wah block. I'll drag it and drop it, and I'm simply just going to right click wah control and set my source as pedal 1. Now, my personal preference is for the toe down position to be off on the wah. So we'll set that to 95% and we'll turn auto engage on to a medium speed. If you prefer having the off position for auto engage with the heel down, just leave that at the stock value of 5%. The Clyde wah sounds great. The Crybaby sounds great. You can just basically start with any of those types. Let's just try the classic Clyde McCoy style wah. That's great for that 60s Hendrix style wah. For me, I personally prefer the Crybaby with the maximum frequency turned down, and if we kick that boost in on there, we get a great lead sound. Next up, let's add some modulation. This is where your personal taste really comes in. Do you prefer a classic phaser, chorus, flanger, or something a bit crazier like a rotary? Let's go with the phaser, and we'll do the Van Halen thing, right? We'll use the Stripe 90. I just like turning the rate down a little bit and the mix down slightly on this one. This just adds some subtle character to your rhythm and lead playing, and again, it works great in conjunction with a boost or the wah. We'll start with it off. you might like trying some of the flanger types in there. You might even try an EQ instead of the drive block in there to hit the front of that Marshall amp. Let's try something like a graphic EQ on here. I'm just going to roll with the stock 10 band. We'll boost 1K, 500 Hertz, and 2K. We'll roll off a bit of high end and low end, and we'll turn the overall level up. This works as an amazing boost as well. Let's add some delay to this. If you're running your delay in front of a crunchy amp like we are here, I'd highly recommend starting with the mono tape. The VP4 has a different mix law to the FM3, FM9, and Axe-FX 3, which means you can run the mix around 20 to 30% in front of a crunchy amp, and it won't be too overbearing. You'd probably need to run that around 3 to 5% on the other Fractal products on here. What I generally like doing is having a delay of around 300 milliseconds on here and pretty much leaving everything else at the stock setting except for the mix. I will bring it down to around 20% on there. This gives you that classic echoplex into a cranked Marshall tone. You combine it with the phaser, the wah, and the drive, and you're in classic rock heaven. There is having some kind of foot controlled filter, then having a modulation effect, again, whether it's a phaser, flanger, chorus, or any of the other modulation types in the VP4, then some kind of way to hit the front end of the amp a little bit harder with a boost or an EQ, and finally an echo or reverb style effect on there for some ambience. And keep in mind, we're running all of that in front of a crunchy amp at the moment. We'll talk about how we can use the 4-cable method in a future video to place things like delay and reverb after your amp's gain stages, but this amp doesn't have an effects loop, so I'm going straight in. A few other factors to consider when you're gigging with a Marshall amp is going to be the type of speakers that you use. Different speakers will have a massive impact on the tone. I'm using greenbacks here at the moment, but other classic speakers that go well with Marshalls are the Marshall T75 speakers. I find modern amps like the DSL or the JVM work really well with those. You've got vintage 30s if you want to get more of a modern hard rock or metal aggressive type of tone out of the amplifier, and then a range of speakers by different companies, whether it be Eminence, Electro Voice. There's some great speakers made by Warehouse Guitar speakers that are variations on the classic Celestion designs, or even Fane speakers, which most of us probably associate with their use in the 70s with Vox and high-watt amplifiers. Another thing to keep in mind is mic placement as well. So if you're trying to manage your tone and volume on stage with a Marshall stack, what I used to do is actually lay the 4x12 cabinet on its side and turn it around from the audience. Then I'd get the sound guy to mic it with the microphone off axis a little bit, and I'll give you some quick examples of those right now. So I've got this SM57 right on the cone of the speaker, and it's very bright. We get this kind of thing. Now, if I move the microphone slightly towards the dust cap and I also pull it back from the speaker a little bit, I can attenuate some of that high end and low end. And finally, let's hear this off-axis position. If you think of this part of the speaker, here's the center, here's the rest of the speaker. You want your microphone essentially to be pointed that way, hence the term off-axis. You can go anywhere between about 45 and 60 degrees. Use your ears to find what's best. Now, of course, more modern Marshall designs have master volume controls on there. Stuff like the JCM 800, 2203 and 2204 still kind of require you to crank the master to get the most out of the amp and really get that classic tone happening, which has to do with a little bit of power amp drive and distortion. But more modern designs like the DSL or JVM have really great master volume controls that will let you scale the overall volume on stage very well. Another thing you can do is have your amp modified. This is an old 70s Marshall that I've had modified with an extra gain stage and a master volume by headfirst amplification. What I'm going to do is play you all out using the preset that we made into this amp. It's got the extra gain stage for some extra aggression on there. And furthermore, I can actually run it at a decent volume, because if this amp didn't have a master volume, there's absolutely no way I could survive more than 30 seconds in the room with it. The actual overall volume is quite low on here, even though it's a 100 watt amp and this is about a 30 watt amp. I can scale this right down so that I can use it in the studio. And of course, I've got that extra headroom in there to play it on stage. If you've got any other questions or requests, let me know in the comments section below. Otherwise, I will see you next week for another episode of the Get Gig Ready series. Go and play your guitars now.